Welcome Alison Gopnik as our third distinguished lecturer for the Natural Philosophy Forum. So Allison is, of course, the leading figure in fields of developmental psychology, cognitive science, and philosophy of mind. She's not only advanced our understanding of the human mind, but also changed the way that we think about learning, about development, about what it means to be human. Paradigmatic natural philosopher. She's a professor of psychology and affiliate of the philosophy department at Berkeley, universally recognized as one of the most important voices in developmental science. Her work spans psychology, cognitive science, and philosophy, and her contributions have had a big impact on fields as far disparate as artificial intelligence, education, and epistemology. So in addition to the very long list of influential academic papers, she's written a number of really, truly beautiful books. Scientist in the Crib, which the New York Times book review called one of the most intriguing and important books on child development ever written, a must-read for any parent. The Philosophical Baby and The Gardener and the Carpenter, which I love, both paint this really compelling vision of childhood as a space for exploration, curiosity, and play. In her work, her public writing, and her teaching, Allison is just really a truly gifted scholar and exceptionally generous intellect. So we couldn't be happier to have her here. Thank you, Allison.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Jeanne, and thanks to Jeanne and Sean for organizing. For organizing this great natural philosophy symposium. I am going to take my definition of natural philosophy to be that I am not going to present any experimental results at all. You'll just have to take it for granted that I'm capable of doing experiments. What I'm going to do is talk about some big problems in philosophy that are also problems in psychology, and I'm going to suggest a somewhat different angle on answering those problems than has usually been suggested, and work out some consequences of that. So the big problem that I'm interested in is, and have been interested in for my whole career, is what you might call the problem of knowledge. So this specific philosophical problem is this. All that comes to us from the world are a bunch of photons hitting our retinas and disturbances of air at our ears. And yet we all live in a world of objects and people and thoughts and ideas, and eventually quarks and leptons and distant planets and origins of the universe. So the puzzle is, how could we ever get here from there or there from here? How could we ever get from that apparently very confused and complicated data to have accurate pictures about the world around us? And I think that's a fundamental problem that unites what might otherwise seem like quite disparate disciplines: machine learning, philosophy of science, epistemology, and developmental psychology and cognitive development. People in all those fields are trying to answer that question. And of course, it's a great ancient philosophical question. Um, Now, going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, since everything is supposed to be a footnote, here's the footnote to Plato that I'm going to present. There have really been two ways of trying to answer that question. And one way, going back to Plato, is saying, look, it just looks as if we derive that abstract hierarchical structure from the data. If you look more carefully, you'll see that really it was there all along. And if you're Plato, it was there in a past life. If you're Descartes, it was in the mind of God. If you're Steve Pinker, it was evolution. And if you're Chomsky, it was in the mind of God. But still, the basic solution is the same, and we have contemporary versions of this in ideas like core knowledge, for example. The alternative approach, going back to Aristotle, the empiricist solution has been to say, look, it just looks as if there's all this abstract hierarchical structure. If you look more carefully, you'll see that it's just statistical agglomerations of the data. It's just putting the data together in more complicated kind of ways. And again, that has a long tradition in philosophy, in various forms of empiricism, and it's had a big comeback in the recent work in AI and machine learning, things like deep learning, are essentially taking that approach to trying to solve the problem. Now, what I'm going to suggest is that a very different kind of literature and a very different set of phenomena are relevant to explaining this problem, solving this problem. And any developmental psychologist, really going back to Piaget, who actually looks at children developing, um, for any of us, these two solutions are not going to seem very satisfactory. Because when we look at children, what we seem to see is from very early, from infancy, they seem to have these kind of abstract hierarchical representations of the world. And yet they seem to change through development. And it looks as if they're changing because the children are getting evidence from the world. And the question is, how is that possible? How could we have a system like that? And what I'm going to suggest today is that an answer to that can come from a rather unusual place, or a place that philosophers haven't thought of very much, which is grandmoms and grandchildren, not people who show up as much in philosophical approaches to the philosophy, to the problem of knowledge. But in fact, what this reflects is an idea that's pervasive in evolutionary biology, which is the idea of life history. So what's life history? Life history is the way that an organism develops, how long a period of childhood it has, how many young it has, how long it lives overall, things about the entire developmental trajectory of an organism. And if you were an Alpha Centauran biologist visiting Earth in the Pleistocene, and you wanted to know what's making this bunch of primates scampering over the veldt different from all the other primates scampering over the veldt, you would not see enormous differences in their theory of mind or their tool use. They'd look pretty similar. But especially since presumably the Alpha Centauran biologists are really good biologists, what you would notice is that the humans have a really strange life history, a really peculiar life history. And you can kind of see this life history illustrated in this photograph. These are 3 children in the same family, my grandchildren, who at that point were 4 and 2 and 6 months. And even the 4-year-old in that picture is pretty helpless, needs to be taken care of. And in fact, human children are helpless, immature, need care for much longer than any of our closest primate relatives. By the time chimps are 7 years old, they're producing as much food as they're consuming. And for humans, that's not true until at least 15, and my son is 35. Uh, and certainly, Augie, the 4-year-old here, is not producing as much food as he's consuming. The other thing is that we also have shorter interbirth intervals than other primates. So this sort of 2 years between the children is pretty standard for humans. And what that means is not only do you have these useless, helpless, hungry children, but you stack them up. You've got even more of them at a particular time. So that seems very bizarre as a life history trait, this very long, protracted helplessness, and even more helplessness, lots and lots of helpless children around. And then there's another aspect of this picture which is very bizarre from a life history perspective, and that is that peering out from behind those beautiful grandchildren, there's a postmenopausal grandmother. And we know that from the time that humans evolved, we've had this kind of extra 20 years past menopause for females, and sort of the equivalent for males. It's more dramatic with women because of menopause, where women are living till 70 or 80, and women have lived till 70 or 80 as long as we've evolved. That's what happens in forager cultures, even though they're going through menopause in their 50s. So why do we have that extra 20 years post-fertility? Again, that seems sort of paradoxical. And none of our close primate relatives, and really, with one exception I'll talk about later on, even our just close mammal relatives have this kind of extended postmenopausal grandmotherhood. So here's these 2 really distinctive features of life history that the Alpha Centauran biologist would have noticed. And she would have, again, because presumably she's a really good biologist, she would have said, that's really interesting because life history is something that predicts a lot of other kinds of traits of an organism. Life history is one of the most important things that happen. Changes in life history are the typical sort of thing that evolves. And as we'll see in a minute, life history predicts other important traits of an animal. So a really strange life history might have to do with other important distinctive things about this group of animals. So I'm going to skip to the TLDR, as we say in Silicon Valley, um, and say, what does this tell us? What does this kind of life history approach? What's it going to tell us about human intelligence and cognition? And the first thing, the most important thing, is that there's no such thing as general intelligence, natural or artificial. When I put up this slide, I made sure it was in big print. When I'm talking to AI people like neurops, there's a sharp intake of breath and there's a whisper of don't tell the VCs about this, right? Um, uh, Instead of thinking about, and a very natural model is to think that there's this thing called intelligence, and some species or people have more of it and some have less of it. And if you're a 35-year-old AI guy, you have more of it than anybody else. And development is building up to the 35-year-old AI guy, and aging is falling off from the 35-year-old AI guy. Now, what I want to argue instead is that the right way to think about it is that there are multiple intelligences, but not only that there are multiple intelligences in the sense that there are different kinds of intelligence at cognition, but importantly, that these intelligences actually trade off against each other. So that, as we'll see, being optimized to do one kind of cognitive task actually makes you worse at other kinds of cognitive tasks. And the three kinds of intelligence that I'm going to talk about all have this character, this kind of trade-off character, trade-off against each other. And what I'm going to suggest is that the three intelligences I'll talk about are what in computer science they talk about as an exploitation-exploration contrast. Maybe exploitation is a little mean to describe the adults. But the typical kind of thing we think of as adult intelligence is having goals, achieving those goals, being able to do planning, being able to do reasoning, being able to do inference, all the things that adults are typically, those 35-year-olds are really good at. But what I'm going to suggest is that there are these other kinds of intelligence, one about exploration, about considering possibilities, about figuring out the structure of the environment and the world, which I think children are especially good at and very well designed to do. And this other, which is even less, has been even less thought about and explored, which is the kind of intelligence that's involved in caring for others, the kind of intelligence that involves taking care of other people, teaching them, passing on resources and information to somebody else. And what I'm going to suggest is that that's actually characteristic of elders and elderhood. Now, of course, any humans at any phase of life can be engaged in cognitive tasks that have all of these kinds of properties. So even babies will try to get towards the nipple and get milk, and elders are concerned about their own resources and state, etc. And even the 35-year-olds at some points are interested in exploration and learning. There's probably some 35-year-olds in the audience here. As well as obviously in caring for children. This is something else that adults do. But what I do want to suggest is that these kinds of, this developmental trajectory, this very strange life history with the long childhood and the long elderhood enables these multiple intelligences to trade off. And I should maybe mention, when I first used to make this point and give this talk, I was quite snarky about the 35-year-olds, as you may have already gathered from my tone of voice. One of the things that I've said is we're basically human up till puberty and after menopause, and in between we're just sort of glorified primates. We're doing the things that all the primates do. We're mating and finding our way in the dominance hierarchy and getting resources and doing all of those kinds of things. But actually, now that my children are 35 and they have 3 children each, I feel like, oh my God, the poor 35-year-olds, the grandmothers and the babies, they're the ones who get to have all the fun. We get to do all the human stuff. We figure out about the world. We have cultural transmission. We have theory of mind. We have narrative, all the fun stuff. And the poor 35-year-olds are just out mating and getting resources and finding their way in the dominance hierarchy. Okay. Uh, so to go back to that, to go back to that, uh, to go back to that um, biologist from the Alpha Centaurian biologist, part of the reason why, as I said, she would have known that life histories go along with these other traits. And in particular, there's a striking correlation. So what I'm going to do is first talk about childhood and the specific life history characteristics of childhood and this exploratory mode. And then I'm going to talk about elderhood and the intelligence of care. So let's start out with childhood. One of the things that comes out of this life history approach is that there's a striking correlation between how long a period of childhood an organism has and how anthropomorphically we would say how smart they are, how flexible they are, how large their brains are, how good they are at learning about new and different environments. And the kind of poster animals for this are actually not even mammals, but birds. You compare the corvids, who are as smart as primates, reach maturity in about 2 years, and our friend the domestic chicken reaches maturity in about 2 weeks. With apologies to any chicken lovers in the audience, which I find there's quite a few of in Silicon Valley nowadays. Let me get rid of this. Okay. Why would you see this relationship between an extended period of childhood and flexibility in learning in the species in general? And what I've suggested is that this reflects something that comes out of computer science, which is the explore-exploit trade-off. So what's the explore-exploit trade-off? One way of thinking about it, the way people have thought about it in optimality theory, is like this. Imagine you're trying to solve a problem. There's a big box of possible solutions that you could get to. You're at one point in that box. What do you do? Well, one thing you could do is you could kind of hill climb. You could look for solutions that are pretty close to the place that you already are, and that's likely to give you a pretty good solution pretty quickly, which you can then go and implement. But there might be a much better solution much further away that's much more different from the thing that you're currently doing. And if you just look closely and locally, you won't find it. On the other hand, the other thing you could do is you could bounce around that space. You could try lots and lots of things that are very different from the thing that you're currently trying. You could introduce a lot of randomness and noise. And that has the advantage, the disadvantage that you're going to be spending a lot of time doing and thinking ridiculous, silly things. Think about your local 4-year-old. But it has the advantage that if there's a solution that is actually a better solution, you're going to be able to find it. And in various kinds of, in computation, people talk about this in terms of something called simulated annealing. The simulated annealing idea is that you start off with a high temperature search, like that noisy, bouncy, random kind of search. And then you gradually cool off to a more local search. So here's just a very simple illustration of this. This is just a simple one-dimensional problem. You're at that point in this space. And actually, it looks like at that point, you're getting a higher value than you would if you moved to one side or to the other side. And you could think of this as being you're stuck in a local optimum. So where you are now is better than where you would get if you just tried to move a little bit to either side. But there's this much better peak that's further away. And the way that people solve this is start out with this high temperature, which lets you explore the space in a really wide way. But if you're just jumping around like this, you're not actually going to be in the right place either. And then as you cool off, you're going to end up in a better place in the space than the place you started out with, and you can get kicked out of that local minimum. And my hypothesis is that childhood is really evolution's way of resolving these trade-offs and doing something like simulated annealing. And from this perspective, many things which you tend to think of as bugs in childhood cognition and childhood behavior actually turn out to be features from the explorer perspective and vice versa. So being noisy, both literally and metaphorically, doing a lot of random things, being impulsive, playing, being driven by curiosity, something we'll talk about in a minute, taking risks. Those are all things that are not a good idea if what you're trying to do is be an effective exploiter, but they are really helpful if what you want to do is explore this space as widely as possible. And I won't go into all the details, but there's a lot of work, both in my lab and in lots of other labs and in lots of other domains, that has lots of examples where younger learners really are more exploratory. My personal favorite is this last paper from Charlie Wu's lab that actually shows that something like annealing is taking place across development. Okay, let me give you a more specific example of this and how I think it plays out in ways that are philosophically interesting and illuminating. So the particular problem of knowledge that I've been working on for 20 years or so is the problem of causal knowledge. Again, an old philosophical problem. How is it that all we see are correlations among events? We see that one event happens, another event happens, that we intervene on the world, and there are particular kinds of outcomes. And yet we think that we know something about the causal structure of the world, and understanding that causal structure is central to the kind of science that we've been talking about all morning in the Natural Philosophy Symposium. And it's also central to our everyday theories, the everyday knowledge of the world that lets us navigate the world. So how is that kind of learning possible? And another set of philosophers, in fact, I was saying I first started interacting with these philosophers at Johns Hopkins right here on this campus in 1985. Another group of more contemporary philosophers have tried to solve this problem, or at least approach a solution to this problem. The first question, of course, is what is it that you mean when you talk about causality anyway? What makes it different from just correlation? And this philosophical view, which I think has become the kind of standard view, is that the thing that's distinctive about causation is that it supports interventions. So, for example, if you think that cigarettes cause lung cancer, then it should be the case that if you intervene to change the rate of smoking, there will be a difference in the rate of lung cancer. On the other hand, you might think that yellow nicotine-stained fingers are associated with lung cancer, and you can predict that someone's more likely to get lung cancer if they have yellow fingers, but you don't think that intervening to wash someone's fingers is going to make them less likely to have lung cancer. So the idea, and I won't go into all the technical details about this, the technical description of it that I find best is using the technical term of wiggling. So essentially the idea is if X causes Y, then wiggling X will make Y wiggle. Introducing variability in one variable, intervening on one variable will cause an effect. And although the definition of intervention is quite abstract in this philosophical work, freely willed intentional human actions are a very good proxy for it. And I can talk about why that is later on. And what that kind of approach enables you to do, as it turns out, is to think about causal learning as hypotheses about these structures, these probabilistic generative models that capture causal structure and that then generate patterns of data, and then using the data to, in a Bayesian way, to determine what structure you have. And I won't go into all the details about this. So this is coming out of philosophy, but back in 2004, we thought maybe we could see whether this was accounting for the causal learning that we see in childhood. And we did this with this, how do you find out whether children are learning about causal structure? We did it with this little device, which we'll still be able to afford even in the terrible new era, the Blicket detector, which only costs maybe $10. It's a little machine that lights up and plays music when you put some things on it and not others. And you can give this machine to the children, give them patterns of dependence, of probability, of intervention, and then see what kinds of causal conclusions they draw about how the machine works. And to a remarkable degree, in a way that surprised even me, it turns out that children do this in a way that looks like it's the ideal normative way that you would do it if, say, you were an ideal scientist. They're incredibly good at taking data, taking information about data, and making the correct causal inference from that information about data. We just did a review paper about this in Nature Reviews, and here's just a few of the things that it turns out that even 4-year-olds can do when it comes to causal learning. But there's still a problem, which is, how is it, we can say, well, children can do this. You give them 2 causal hypotheses, you give them data, they'll pick the right one, or they'll pick the one that's more probable. But what kind of computations are they doing? What's enabling them to solve these problems? And one of the things that we notice about children is, as I said before, they explore, they're active learners, they play. One of the things we discovered with the Blicket detector was the biggest problem with using the Blicket detector was keeping the kids away from the detector. And we had to do a whole lot of things first off to try and keep them from actually just playing with the detector and letting us show them the patterns of dependency. We had to say, you get to play with it when we're finished asking all these stupid questions. Um, uh, and intuitively, and there's a lot of elegant work, including by Lisa Feigenson here, showing just how driven even infants are to do this kind of exploration. We sort of take it for granted. And in scientists, we call this experimentation. In 2-year-olds, we call it getting into everything. That's like their greatest motivation. So the question is, could we provide some kind of computational account of this kind of active learning and exploration? And I'll go through this a bit quickly because I think a lot of people here have heard it. The answer to this actually may be coming from a very different kind of, discipline, a very different kind of theory, namely reinforcement learning. And as a boomer psychologist, when I first saw the renaissance of reinforcement learning, I was sort of horrified. I thought, are they going to make us wear bell bottoms next? You know, this is back to the 50s. Um, uh, but actually, reinforcement learning has been very influential in neuroscience. It's one of the central techniques that's used in modern machine learning. Um, but it doesn't look as if, and reinforcement learning you could think of, and people like Jim Woodward, the philosophers, have said this, is a kind of proto-causal learning, because what happens in reinforcement learning is the animal performs an action, there's an outcome of that action, and then, in a sense, implicitly, the animal recognizes the causal link between that action, that intervention, and the outcome. Um, but of course, it's very limited. It's limited to the animal's own actions. And even more importantly, it's limited to outcomes that involve reward, outcomes that involve utility, positive rewards or negative rewards. That's the way that, those are the outcomes that are shaping those. So like the only causal relations that really count are, I did something, did it make me better off or did it make me worse off? But recently and it doesn't look like that's a kind of setup that could get you to the kind of causal learning that we see in science or that we see in childhood. But recently there's been a whole lot of attempts to use the basic apparatus of reinforcement learning, but instead of having external utility-based rewards like cheese or shock, instead you have these internal epistemic rewards. So what you can do is say, okay, you're going to be rewarded for something like information gain. So set up a reinforcement learning system, but now you're actually rewarded for finding out more about the world. You're rewarded for getting more information. You're rewarded for seeing something that's new that you haven't seen before. And there's been a whole lot of different kinds of attempts to do that. And you could think about that as, the reward system of science, something like that, something like this intrinsic epistemic reward. The problem is that if you just technically take something like novelty or information gain as your reward, you have, again, I realize this is a boomer thing, you have the noisy TV problem. In the olden days, for all of you here who are young, we used to have staticky TVs in the middle of the night. And if you just look at a pattern of random static, you're getting lots of novelty, you're getting lots of entropy, you're getting a lot of information, but it's not doing you any good. It's not the sort of thing that would enable you to, say, work out a theory of the world. So the question is, are there other kinds of intrinsic rewards that you could have that would actually enable you to learn things that were good things to learn, like learning a theory of the world? Sorry. Anyway, it's okay. But more recently, there's been an interesting set of work using an intrinsic reward called empowerment. And empowerment involves the relationship between your actions and the outcomes of those actions. And in particular, it involves maximizing the mutual information between your actions and the outcomes of those actions. So it doesn't matter what the outcome is. And as we'll see in a minute, it could be really bad. In fact, in some experiments I'll talk about, it could be a shock. But the fact that that outcome is systematically related to what you've done is itself rewarding. So you could think about this as a system that rewards controllability. What you really want is to be able to find the things that you can control, you can influence out in the environment. And that's what you want, and that's what's driving your action and exploration. And what I've argued recently is that this empowerment gain idea is very closely tied to the idea of causal learning in the interventionist framework. Because if you think about that interventionist framework, remember what it says is what causation means is that if you wiggle X, then your Y will wiggle. So what it's saying is what causation is about controllability. What causation is about the mutual information, the predictability of outcomes from interventions, the interventions that someone's performing. And what that means is that gaining empowerment, having a better sense of control of the environment, necessarily is going to involve causal knowledge, and vice versa. Learning more about the causal structure of the world is going to give you a kind of empowerment that you wouldn't have had before, which of course is the reason why we fund science. It actually makes a difference to what we can do in the world. And it turns out that in psychology, even very, very young babies already seem to be driven by empowerment. This is a classic experiment where Carolyn Roby Collier did, where the baby there's a ribbon that's attached to the baby and then attached to this mobile. And even 3-month-olds will start kicking to try and bring about the mobile, and then they'll change how they kick. And they don't seem to be driven by the reward of the mobile. They really seem to be driven by the reward of the contingency between the mobile and between their actions and outcomes. Now, one of the wonderful things about being a grandmother in 2025 is that you're constantly getting cute videos of your grandchildren. So here is a video of Kit. He's actually listening to his grandfather play the piano, and he has a little xylophone that he's trying to activate as well, trying to make a bunch of noises. And what you can see is that he tries first with the mallet, then he tries with the stick end of the mallet, then he takes his little hand and he tries using his hand, which makes no noise at all. He tries using the bars that are further away, he tries the bars that are closer, and in the course of it, his grandfather says, "Don't put the mallet in your mouth, kid," which will bring up a point that we'll have in a minute. I think Stephen was saying, as he was watching it, all he could think is, he's going to stick it in his eye. And this is a case of a child trying to get as much empowerment as possible, trying to work out the systematic relationships between his actions and their outcomes, even though there isn't a sort of obvious utility that comes from this. And it's interesting because this is a causal relationship that never existed in the Pleistocene. This is a causal relationship that only exists because people have actually created it. And I think thinking about causation in terms of empowerment has some interesting consequences for the metaphysics of causation as well as the epistemics of causation. So what that suggests is something like a view that people like Peter Godfrey Smith have called a kind of causal pluralism. The way that I always used to think about causation, and I think the philosophers I talked about in the beginning thought about causation, is as if it's like vision. There's an inverse problem. Causation is out there in the world. We get data. We're trying to recover the causation in the world from the data. But this empowerment perspective suggests there might be many, many different things that from a God's eye point of view are very different from one another. And what makes them causal is that they support this kind of intervention, that they allow you to intervene and control the world in a particular way. And one of the consequences of that is that you could think about causal learning as much as a kind of intuitive engineering as a kind of intuitive science. And reinforcement learning is a kind of intuitive engineering. It's about how you go out into the world and change the world based on your mind rather than how you change your mind based on the world. And empowerment sort of supports this more engineering-like picture about causation. So I think this way of thinking has consequences for the metaphysics of causation as well. Okay, now let me switch gears. I've been talking so far about the children and the kind of exploration that they do. Now I want to switch gears and talk about elders and caregiving. And I want to start out with what I think is one of the nicest experiments in psychology. You go back to Psychology 101, right? Psychology 101 tells you put a rat in a maze and the rat goes down one arm of the maze and it gets shocked, goes down the other arm of the maze and nothing happens. It will never go down the arm of the maze that has the shock in it anymore, right? That's Psych 101, avoidance learning. But it turns out this is only true for adult rats, that if you do the same experiment with a juvenile rat, the rat will actually prefer to go down the arm that leads to the shock. Anyone who has 2-year-olds or teenagers will recognize this. So in effect, what's happening is the empowerment reward is clearly overriding the sort of straightforward reinforcement learning reward. But there's an interesting catch. So this is a lovely example of what I've been saying about juveniles exploring. But there's an interesting catch to this, which is that it only happens if the mother is present. In fact, it only happens if the juvenile can smell the mother in the environment. And Nim Tottenham recently did the same thing with children and found the same effect. So we don't shock 3-year-olds, but we have a really unpleasant noise. And if the caregiver is present, then the children will do this kind of exploration, but not if the caregiver is absent. And that leads to the second part of what I want to talk about, which is the idea of caregiving and the philosophy of caregiving. I really love this picture. This is a picture we put in the Daedalus issue. This is from 1660, and it illustrates the incredible pull that caregiving has. And I think it's even more compelling if you realize that this was done during an epidemic of plague in 1660 in Amsterdam. So this child might very well be dying, and the mother who's taking care of the child might very well be dying as a result of her caregiving. Nevertheless, when you look at this picture, the impulse to take care of what's obviously a sick child is obviously strong for the mother and strong for the viewer as well. And in spite of this, caregiving has been remarkably absent from philosophy, psychology, political science, economics, you name it, all the social sciences. Even though it's so morally compelling, it's something we do more than anything else, it's deeply part of our biological inheritance, but it's just sort of nobody says anything about it or pays attention to it. Margaret Levy, who's been working on this project with me, and I, at one point, after we'd gone through some other literature where it doesn't say anything about caregiving, we're trying to figure out, is there anything in common about all the people, like all the political scientists and the economists who never said anything about caregiving? And we decided they're tall. That's the common factor. So I've written about this in Daedalus twice, in an article thinking about moral political economy, and also in this I've also edited this recent issue, trying to remedy the fact that caregiving has been so invisible in the social sciences literature. And as I said, this is particularly striking because caregiving has this incredibly important biological role. So just as the early childhood, the long childhood seems to be associated with large brain size, more parental investment sort of makes sense if you have more needy children, is associated with larger brain size. So if you compare, now we're talking about marsupials, if you compare these two marsupials, the quokkas and the Virginia possum, the possums have big litters of babies all at once. The babies are mature within weeks. The quokkas just have one baby at a time that they keep in their pouch, and both the father and the mother are involved in caregiving. And the quokkas have brains that are twice as big as the possums, even though they're overall the same size. And for humans, just as we're out on the end of the spectrum in terms of how many immature babies we have around, we're also at the end of the spectrum in terms of parental investment. So we have pair-bonded fathers, which happens only in about 5% of mammals who are involved in taking care of babies. We have alloparents, people who aren't kin who are taking care of babies. And then we have the one that I mentioned before, my favorite, menopausal grandmothers. And in fact, on top of that, for humans, we actually extend care relations past kin and children to involve taking care of elders or taking care of students for people in this room, taking care of patients, taking care of people who are ill. We can even extend it to taking care of the planet or taking care of the dead or using USAID to take care of people in Uganda. And there's another distinctively human aspect of care, which is that for humans, care is very deeply related to culture and to cultural transmission. So in addition to caring for the young, what we do is pass on information as well as resources to the young. And it's an interesting side note that that the only other mammal that we know of that has postmenopausal grandmothers, the orca, also has cultural traditions which are passed on by those grandmothers from generation to generation. So there's something about care and cultural transmission that go together. But if you think about it from a philosophical perspective, caregiving is really paradoxical. So think about the structure of caregiving. Classic, I don't know if we were talking about game theory before, right? Classic kind of game theoretic way of thinking about agents is you have two agents. One agent has some resources and has some goals. The other agent has other resources and other different goals. What happens when they interact with one another? One thing that can happen, the classic basis of economics and political science, is they can have a contract. They can exchange their resources to advance their goals, and you can escape from prisoner's dilemma and so forth by doing this. Another thing that could happen is that when A has more resources than B, B is going to subordinate their goals to A. That seems very straightforward. That's a power relationship. Um, but what happens in care is that A has more resources than B, and therefore A subordinates their goals to B. So what happens in care is because the child is helpless, because your father can't function, can't drive the car anymore, because the ill person is ill, because the students are clueless and don't understand all the things that you do. Those are actually the reason why we feel that we have to pass on resources to them. And not only do we pass on resources, but we do it in a really distinctive way. So sometimes what we do is just pass on resources to maximize what you might think of as the recipient's objective utilities. We make peanut butter sandwiches. But sometimes, even if we think that their utilities are not ours, and even if we think they're not in the interest of the person that we're caring for, we think that part of our role as a caregiver is to help them to get what they want rather than what we think that they should want. For my 4-year-old grandson, this involves watching Paw Patrol for many, many, many hours. Definitely not in my interest and not clearly in his interest, but definitely his subjective utility. And an even more subtle thing that I think goes on in care that goes back to what I was saying about empowerment as an intrinsic reward is the idea that really what you're trying to do when you care for someone else is to give them a range of resources that allow them to articulate and formulate their own goals, right? And achieve those goals. So something like giving them autonomy. And I think that this is actually nicely captured by the idea of empowerment. What we're doing when we care for someone is empowering that person. What we're doing is not just giving them things or helping them to accomplish a particular goal, but giving them the resources they need to articulate, to formulate goals, and to formulate goals in a way that they can actually accomplish them themselves. So what I want to argue, and this is my last point, is that the combination of this kind of intelligence of care, which is very distinctive and very much unlike the kinds of things that people have thought about in cognitive science or in economics or the other social sciences, and the exploration that you see in childhood, that combination is actually the thing that lets us solve the problem of knowledge as well as other problems. So think back to that rat who's exploring, but only when the mother's present. Essentially, what the mother is doing from a biological functional perspective is providing the space in which that kind of exploration can take place. So at least one function that care serves is that it gives you a garden, as I said in my earlier book, that you can explore without worrying about what your immediate utilities are going to be, without worrying about whether you're going to poke yourself in the eye with a stick as you're figuring out how the xylophone works. So the last point I want to make is that what this suggests is that this kind of developmental diversity, this kind of developmental division of labor, is itself a precondition for the kinds of intelligence that we see in humans. And if we're going to try and design genuinely intelligent AI systems, they should have this kind of developmental character. And here I'll end by recommending Ted Chiang's wonderful book, The Life Cycle of Software Objects, which actually describes what it would be like to have AIs who had both the developmental sequence and the relationships of care that human children have. So let me stop there. Let me, as usual, acknowledge my intellectual children, and it would be nice to think intellectual caregivers, the various foundations and others who have supported this research and thinking. And let me stop there and answer questions.
So this is going to just be an open-ended question. I was wondering to what extent being academic allows one to continue to explore.
Right.
And then I was thinking about funding when you brought up funding at the end. And two models for funding. One is you fund the person.
Exactly.
And one is you fund some particular project that
Right.
that's proposed, right? And I lament that we don't have as much funding around nowadays for funding the person,
Right.
playing the role of the mother, creating that safe space for exploration. And so I was just wondering if you have thoughts.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I didn't hit this in the slides, but there's all sorts of other fascinating things about the way caregiving works. One thing is tends to be very local, so it's not something that you can just generalize or scale up. But another is that it has this kind of transparency about it. So, you don't know what kind of a baby you're going to get. And amazingly, you get the baby and you love this baby kind of randomly, no matter what their characteristics are, for a very long period for the rest of your life. That's a very strange kind of human relationship, but it's very characteristic of the way that care relationships go. And that's really funding the person, right? So that's really saying, this other person that I'm caring for, I don't know whether my child is going to end up, contributing to the world. And I can't know beforehand. But in fact, exactly that kind of transparent care is the thing that enables there to be a very wide variety of potential options, especially in a non-stationary environment, especially if the environment is going to change, which is actually the context in which human beings evolved. And you'd think that funding agencies would realize the same thing. And I think to some extent they do. You support a diverse variety of different kinds of science, and when something new happens, we'll be able to adjust to that novelty. So I think you're absolutely right. What we're really doing when we love our babies is funding the person, or maybe vice versa.
So you mentioned that adults tend to exploit more, but even in among adults, people seem to lie on a kind of a spectrum. Some people are more inclined to explore, like artists or academic researchers, for example. They would like to explore much more as compared to, let's say, a tax accountant. So, and even for a single individual, circumstances might dictate how much they might explore. Like if you're in a kind of fight or flight situation, you're much less likely to explore. You're much more focused on fight or flight. So, so the question is there some kind of neuroscientific knob which gets tuned? Maybe it shifts towards exploiting when you're an adult, but it can be tuned. So it can be tuned towards more exploration, maybe consciously.
Yeah, that's a great question. Very appropriately for Johns Hopkins. One of the things that we know is that I didn't talk about the neural basis for this at all, but there's very good neural evidence for this early period of exploration, and in particular, wide-ranging plasticity, lots of possibilities for synaptic connection. The early brain has many, many, many local possible connections, and then what happens is there's this period of pruning that turns that brain that's very well designed for flexibility and plasticity into a brain that's much better designed for actual action, where now you have long distance, highly myelinated, pruned pathways. And one of the interesting things about psychedelics, for example, is that the way they seem to work is that they reintroduce plasticity. And I think some of both the phenomenology and the possible therapeutic effects are coming because they're basically kicking you back into a more childlike state, a state that's more like childhood. And if you've ever watched a 2-year-old or a 6-month-old going, "Whoa, my hand, it's so cool," right? I was talking about awe, and I was saying my awe, Thalo, who's one of my grandchildren, my 4-year-old, the most awesome thing in the world is a garbage truck. Like, a garbage truck is so amazing and so cool, and you could spend so much time looking at it. But what I think is interesting is if you look historically and culturally, what seems to happen even with adults is that you really have to bracket the exploration and the exploitation. So you go on a retreat, or you have a period that's a sabbatical, or you have religious experiences. I think those are all examples of the way that we segregate out exploration and exploitation. And we also have a kind of division of labor that's a division of labor, not a developmental division of labor, where we allow people to be shamans or artists or scientists. And we sort of say, okay, your job is going to be to take over that function. But I think what's important is it's not like we can the point is there is a trade-off. We can't maximize both of those functions at the same time. And we have to figure out either this kind of developmental alternation or a division of labor kind of alternation, the kind you get in social insects, for example, where you have scouts and worker bees, to try to deal with that trade-off. And that also always involves care, in the sense that in order for that trade-off to work, someone has to provide the resources to the people who are going to do the exploration. You can't have both of those things in the same way and at the same time, as in the funding agencies of the federal government or all the places that are not providing care at the moment. So
My question is related to altruism, because it seems like there's a lot of overlap between the concept of altruism and caregiving. And even though you mentioned that caregiving was not studied extensively in the literature, altruism has been.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of empirical and theoretical work on altruism in economics, game theory,
right.
theoretical biology, evolutionary biology, etc. So I was wondering whether there was any specific reason as to why you wanted to separate these two, and if there is a relevance, and how much you can borrow or import from the studies of altruism into caregiving.
No, that's exactly right. So one of the things that's characteristic about caregiving is that it's altruistic, right? It's intrinsically altruistic. But one of the things that's interesting, as far as I know, the kind of game theoretic evolutionary biology accounts of altruism all try to cash it out in terms of a contract. So the idea is that, you have tit for tat, right? You have one person is reciprocally, the assumption behind altruism is that there's going to be some reciprocity somewhere down the line in terms of what the relationship is like. And a very interesting philosophical idea, Kim Sterelny has talked about this, is that, so care doesn't seem to have that character. Like, you might think that your children are going to take care of you when you grow up, but believe me, this is not such a great thing to rely on, right? An affectionate text message once a month, you're doing really well. So, on the one hand, you have 10 years of wiping their behinds and completely dedicating yourself. On the other, you have the affectionate text message once a month. But an interesting idea that Kim Sterelny argues is that, if you have a tit-for-tat account of altruism, you have to always worry about defectors. And it's going to be very hard over a long period of time not to have the temptation to defect taking place. And the way that that's cashed out in psychology is typically things like cheater detection or justice or third-person punishment. But another way you could cash it out is its commitment. So an example that I like is if Bonnie and Clyde are in the prisoner's dilemma, they don't rat on each other, but it's not that they don't rat on each other because they have a contract. It's because I love Bonnie more than I love myself. It would be worse for me for her to go to jail than for me to go to jail. And obviously that's going to be even more true with someone that you're caring for. So I think there is a connection, but I think it has to come through this commitment kind of mechanism picture, and I think it's a nice example where the contract reciprocal kind of story has been the story that's been the game theoretic kind of story. Oh, let me say one more thing about that I think is interesting. I was talking about this at Stanford, and one of the Deborah Satz, who's a ethics philosopher, feminist philosopher, said, look, you're basing all this care on inequality. What you're saying is the way that care works is one person has more resources than the other. It's horrible, right? Why don't we just get rid of all the inequalities? And the answer is the inequalities are part of this developmental life history. We couldn't have the life history. We couldn't have the trade-offs work unless there were periods in which people didn't have resources. And the fact that you're a child, the fact that you grow up, the fact that you get ill, the fact that you get old, the fact that you die, those are intrinsic to the human condition. And you couldn't have that developmental trajectory unless you also had these mechanisms for care.
I want to open by saying thank you for coming all the way out here. It's a wonderful way to end the night of the philosophy symposium. And my question kind of centers around sibling dynamics in a way. I have 4 siblings. My brother's actually here. He's behind me in the green turtleneck. Yeah. And I'm kind of curious if older sibling like him is forced to grow up quick in a way, right? Because he has all these
Right.
younger siblings. Would he be in a way forced out of the exploration stage and into the empowerment stage early? Or would his exploration stage kind of mold to caregiving?
Right.
Do you think like the phase would accelerate or it kind of stay the same developmentally?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, and I keep telling myself I keep leaving siblings out of this, and for most of history, older siblings were doing as much of the care, and older cousins and older children in general were doing a lot of the caregiving. And in the course of doing that caregiving, of course, they were learning how to be caregivers. They didn't like have to go to Reddit parenting to figure out how to do caregiving because they'd already done a bunch of caregiving. Um, uh, there is another point, though, and actually Willem Frankenhuis and I who's a kind of evolutionary biologist modeler, and I have a paper about this. There's a lot of evidence that adverse child experiences, as they're called, signals early in development that resources are really going to be thin, that you don't have the protective or are unpredictable, that you don't have this kind of protective context. The effect that has is to make the explore-exploit shift happen more quickly. And even if you look at brain development, somewhat counterintuitively, the effect of early adversity is to speed up brain development rather than to retard or slow it. So it's like you're getting into that adult state too quickly, or in any case, more quickly than you would if you had more protection. You had more protection early on. And I think there's a lot of evidence for that, and we've argued for that theoretically. Now, the sibling case is interesting because what is it, when on the one hand, becoming a caregiver as a sibling is a way of learning how to be a caregiver. On the other hand, it involves a kind of exploit responsibility. I think it's interesting to think about, something like having a baby doll, right? One of the things that kids do more than anything else is pretend caregiving. And I think you could think of that as exactly as you said, that one of the things that kids should be exploring is what's the range of caregiving? How does it work? How does it work with my puppy versus my doll versus my younger sister? What happens when I try this caregiving mode? And I think that's right. I think a way of thinking of it is you're actually exploring that at the same time that you're actually caregiving. There's lovely examples in forager cultures about things like apparently you have little rats that just the children hunt that have no meat on them but are really easy to hunt, and it's sort of designated that what children do is go out and hunt these little animals that aren't actually worth eating, but that is the way that you actually learn how to do the hunting that you would do later on. One more thing to say about that is there's a beautiful study that we have in a edition of Philosophical Transactions that actually, I don't know if Mike Tomasello is here, but Mike Tomasello and I co-edited this about life history. There's a lovely paper by Michael Gervin that shows that if you look at hunting, how do you learn how to hunt? Well, it turns out if you're the 35-year-old, it takes a long time to be a really good hunter, and it's about 35 when you get to be a really, really expert hunter. And the 35-year-old is going to do much better in terms of actually hunting if he doesn't have a bunch of 10-year-olds running around after him trying to figure out how he's hunting. So what happens is the 35-year-olds, the best hunters, go off by themselves. Then the elders, those post 50 to 70 hunters who aren't as good at hunting anymore but know a lot about hunting, actually take the 13 and 14 and 15-year-olds out hunting. They don't bring back as much meet. But what they've done is actually train those are the 13 and 14-year-olds who are going to be the 35-year-old hunters. So the elders are playing a really important role in, and you can see that, think about that with caregiving as well, that the grandmom's the one who's showing the younger sibs what they should do to succeed with the other children. And you know, just a bit of a policy point, the separation that we have between elders and children and adults, geographically and politically, I think is a terrible disaster, that one of the things we need to do is bring back old people and young people.
Thank you very much. So if we ever get into an argument, I'll just tell him I made him a better caregiver.
Yes, that's right. That's right. By the way, I'm the oldest sibling of 6. So I know what that's like. By the way, I still, two of my younger brothers are writers. One of my younger brother just had a book that came out. And when I read a negative review of one of his books, I feel like, what did I do? I wasn't there. What's wrong? Why wasn't I taking care of Blake, who's a 65-year-old art critic for the New York Times? You know, like, something's wrong. I should have made sure that reviewer didn't say those nasty things.
Still your little brother, though, at the end of the day.
Yeah, he's still my little brother.
Well, thank you for that. I now feel justified in my kind of like overbearingness with it. So thank you. And also thank you for coming all the way out here. I was going to ask a question on how does trauma affect like a child born in like a third world country or with
Right.
lack of resources? How does that affect their exploratory stage? Does it feel rushed? But you kind of already answered that.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if, let's say they get relocated and they're taken now back into like a more safe environment. Is that period of exploratory growth kind of cut, or is it just resumed now that they're in a more stable condition?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we know that that there's a tremendous resilience, and that there's, you know, even something like having a good marriage, you know, having a care relationship as an adult seems to be something that can compensate for early adversity. But as so often in the human case, there's a lot of cycles. One of the interesting things also, speaking about siblings, is that the adversity effects are really modulated by things like, just, is there a teacher who's taking care of you? Is there an older sibling who's taking care of you? Even if it's only once a week, if there's a grandmother or a great aunt, but you can have a model of, oh, I can be taken care of, that seems to have a big effect on the ultimate adversity. So I think there is some evidence for resilience. The famous example of this is like the Romanian orphans who were adopted into American families, and they start out being in terrible shape, terribly having terrible consequences. They recover to a much larger extent than anyone thought, given what their first 2 or 3 years of life was like. But then it turns out that there's still, if you compare them to the typically developing child, there's still damage over the long run, even in adulthood.
I left academia a while ago, so I am that 35-year-old AI guy.
Yeah, right.
Um,
Sorry.
yeah. So let me try to keep my vague idea quick. So you mentioned that you classified intelligence as exploration, exploitation, and empowerment,
Right.
and hypothesized that nature's way of solving the first two is through simulated annealing during child development.
Right.
I'm thinking, would it also be a case where across individuals, not within an individual's development, across individuals, aka the grandparent problem, like the grandmother problem, is it also possible that nature is also using simulated annealing to solve this empowerment / caregiving problem across an individual's lifespan?
There's a lot of evidence that just the natural process of getting older leads people to be more altruistic, for example. And there's really nice controlled experiments that show that this is true. And I think the phenomenon that people talk about, the sort of paradoxical phenomenon that people get happier, even though lots of things, you know, are creaky and don't work as well as they used to, at least until they get very old, people generally report more happiness. And I think that's partly because they've been released from the sort of 35-year-old hedonic treadmill of trying to accomplish all of these ends. A question that people have asked is, are the elders also showing this broader exploratory kind of behavior. And there's some possible reasons to think that might be true. For instance, you see less prefrontal control in elders, and that's another one of those things that's typically seen as being, oh, this is a terrible problem, you don't have as much prefrontal control. But you know that children also don't have as much prefrontal control, and that having less prefrontal control seems to lead to more creativity, more variability, something like a more high temperature surge. So I think it's very much up for grabs about whether that's true or not. It's definitely a hypothesis. But I wanted to say one more thing in the context of the 35-year-old AI guys, which is that it's interesting that the annealing piece is something that people do use in AI. In fact, that's where it comes from. It's fascinating that when you ask people, how do you use it? How do you decide what temperature? How do you decide whether to, one of the things that often happens is, as in physical annealing, as presumably the physicists will know, actually having multiple rounds of annealing is more effective than just having one. And you ask people in AI, what's the theory about how it works, or when you do it, or how, and they say, you twiddle the dials until you get the outcome that you want. There isn't really a good theoretical account. On the other hand, I think that there's actually an interesting story about care in the context of AI as well. I mentioned the Ted Chiang. So if you think about the alignment problem, which is the big problem that everyone worries about, how do you get the goals of the artificial system to line up with the goals to be good, right? Well, one way you can do that, which I think of, again, this may be a boomer reference, as the Stepford wife way of solving this, is you just get the AI to figure out what you want and then do what you want, right? That's kind of the way that people have typically thought about the alignment problem. But you don't really want that, because if it's actually going to be intelligent, you want it to be able to be flexible and have new goals given a new environment or a new situation, which might not be the goals that you trained it to have. And the interesting thought is, essentially, every time you raise a child, you're facing the alignment problem, right? So every time you raise a child, you face this problem about, here's the goals that I have, here's the goals that helped me as a grandmother in the 60s. I'm not sure those are the right goals. That's the right set of goals and values. But on the other hand, I want you to have goals and values that are good ones, not bad ones. And one of the things that care teaching empowerment niche can do is to help you to solve that kind of human alignment problem. How do you manage to get a new generation that will have the right kind of values and the right kind of goals, even if they're not the same as the values and goals that you already have? How do you balance that sort of tradition and innovation and a kind of conservatism versus a kind of progressivism? And I think that looking at care would, that this is my moral is, AIs need mothers. If you actually really wanted to solve, if you really had intelligent agents, which I don't think you do at the moment, but if you created intelligent agents, you'd need something like care. Our relationship to them should be a relationship of care. That would be a better way of thinking about it than thinking of them as our slaves on the one hand or our masters on the other.
Thank you so much.
Thank Allison again. If you enjoyed the talk, then we have the Natural Philosophy Forum here at Johns Hopkins, and there's a web page, naturalphilosophyhopkins.org. You can go there to find out about events and also sign up for the email list and get all the forthcoming events in your mailbox. We're looking forward to seeing you next time.